The final amen echoed through the packed church auditorium. Hundreds of worshippers stood as their choir sang softly in the background. Pastor Samuel stepped away from the pulpit and smiled at the congregation. "My brothers and sisters," he said, raising his Bible, "today is our Covenant Sunday. Anyone believing God for a breakthrough should come forward. I will pray for each of you personally." Immediately, people rushed towards the altar. Some came believing for children, others came praying for healing. Some wanted financial breakthroughs. Among them stood Mrs. Grace. Everyone in the church knew her. She owned supermarkets, transport companies, and several buildings across the state. Yet, despite her wealth, she was humble. Every month she paid school fees for struggling children, quietly settled hospital bills for widows, and donated food to orphanages. She never announced her generosity. She believed that what she did for God should remain between her and God. As she stood in the line waiting for prayer, something unusual happened. A strange feeling settled over her heart. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anxiety. It was a deep uneasiness she couldn't explain. The pastor continued praying for people one after another. Some cried, some knelt, some shouted with joy. The closer he came to Mrs. Grace, the stronger the feeling became. Finally, only one person stood before her. Pastor Samuel smiled. "Sister Grace." He lifted his hand toward her head. Before his hand touched her, Mrs. Grace quietly stepped backward. The pastor paused. "My daughter." She forced a smile. "I'm sorry, Pastor. I I don't feel comfortable." The church became silent. Nobody had ever refused the pastor's prayer. People exchanged puzzled glances. Pastor Samuel smiled politely. "As you wish." Mrs. Grace returned to her seat, but her heart continued beating faster than normal. That night she barely slept. Just before dawn, she dreamed she was standing alone inside the church. The building was empty. No choir, no congregation, no ushers. Only the pastor stood at the altar. He stretched out his hand towards her. As she stepped back, the walls around her began to crack. The beautiful sanctuary faded until it looked old and abandoned. She woke up suddenly. Her heart was racing. She wasn't convinced the dream meant anything, but it stayed with her. The following Sunday, the pastor once again invited members forward for personal prayer. Again, Mrs. Grace joined the line. Again, she felt the same uneasiness. Again, just before the pastor reached her, she quietly stepped aside. People whispered. Some wondered if she had offended the pastor. Others assumed she was ill. After the service, Pastor Samuel approached her with a warm smile. "My daughter, is everything all right?" "Yes, Pastor." "You've refused prayer twice now." She hesitated. "I don't know how to explain it. I simply feel I should wait." The pastor nodded. "I will keep praying for you." His smile never faded. But as Mrs. Grace walked away, she noticed his expression change for a brief moment. It was so quick that she almost convinced herself she had imagined it. Weeks passed. Mrs. Grace continued attending church, but something no longer felt right. She began paying closer attention. She noticed people were constantly being pressured to give beyond their means. Those who donated large amounts received special recognition. Those who asked questions were quietly pushed aside. Every sermon seemed to end with another fundraising appeal. Church projects multiplied. Yet, little information was ever shared about how the money was used. Some members whispered privately that they were struggling financially after trying to meet every demand. Mrs. Grace became concerned. She decided to review the church publicly available financial record as a donor. The figures didn't add up. Expenses appeared repeatedly under different names. Construction projects were billed multiple times. Companies receiving contracts all seemed connected to the same small group of people. She said nothing. She simply continued observing. One evening, an elderly deacon visited her unexpectedly. His face looked troubled. "Madam Grace," he said quietly, "I have served this church for 20 years. I fear something is terribly wrong." He explained that every respected elders had resigned quietly after raising questions about finances. Records had disappeared. Meetings were held without proper minutes. Anyone who questioned leadership was accused of lacking faith. "I don't know what is happening anymore," the deacon admitted. "I only know this isn't the church I once knew." Mrs. Gray prayed for wisdom. Instead of spreading rumors, she began gathering facts. She consulted accountants. She reviewed publicly filed documents. She compared contracts and payment records. The deeper she looked, the more disturbing the picture became. Large donations intended for community outreach had been redirected into businesses secretly owned by associates of Pastor Samuel. Luxury vehicles had been purchased using church funds. Properties were registered under shell companies rather than the church itself. The evidence pointed not to spiritual wrongdoing, but to calculated financial fraud. When Mrs. Grace quietly informed a few trusted church members, they were shocked. Some refused to believe her. Others began their own investigations. Word eventually reached Pastor Samuel. He immediately requested a private meeting. Mrs. Grace declined. He requested another. She declined again. His messages became increasingly urgent. "I fear people are misleading you. Please let us talk." She replied only once. "If the records are correct, they will speak for themselves." Within the weeks, attendance began to fall. Members wanted answers. Questions multiplied. Donations decreased. The pastor's influence began to weaken. The luxurious lifestyle that had once impressed everyone suddenly attracted suspicion. Late one evening, Pastor Samuel arrived uninvited at Mrs. Grace's home. A security guard informed her. She agreed to meet him on the front veranda. He looked exhausted. "Grace," he began quietly, "you can stop all this." "I haven't started anything," she replied calmly. "I've only asked for transparency." "You don't understand." "Then help me understand." He looked away. If this continues, everything I've built will collapse. Mrs. Grace answered gently. If it was built on truth, it will stand. If it is built on deception, it should fall. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, finally left without another word. The church board commissioned an independent audit. Months later, the report was completed. Billions of naira could not be properly accounted for. Conflict of interest contracts had been awarded without approval. Personal expenditures had been disguised as ministry expenses. The findings were impossible to ignore. Pastor Samuel resigned before disciplinary proceedings concluded. Law enforcement opened an investigation into alleged financial crimes. Many people who had once admired him struggled to accept the truth. The consequences reached beyond his public reputation. His family, who had known little about his financial dealings, found themselves facing public scrutiny and hardship. His eldest son left university to support the family after assets were frozen during the investigation. Relationships within the household became strained. Friends disappeared. The influence that money had once purchased vanished almost overnight. Pastor Samuel later admitted in a written statement that he had gradually convinced himself that small compromises were acceptable if they helped him maintain the appearance of a successful ministry. Those compromises grew into deception. The deception grew into fraud, and eventually the lies consumed everything he had spent years building. Months later, Mrs. Grace stood once again in a small church, not a grand auditorium, but a modest congregation where the pastor spoke more about serving people than impressing them. At the end of the service, the pastor invited anyone who desired prayer to come forward. Mrs. Grace smiled. This time, she stepped forward without hesitation. The pastor prayed simply. No spectacle, no pressure, no promises of instant wealth, only a sincere prayer for wisdom, strength, and faith. As she returned to her seat, she realized the lesson she will never forget. True faith is never afraid of honesty. A genuine servant of God does not demand unquestioning loyalty, and no person's wealth, influence, or charisma should ever replace wisdom, accountability, and discernment. From that day on, whenever people in our town spoke about the rise and fall of the once famous pastor, they remembered one woman who quietly trusted her conscience, sought the truth with patience, and refused to let fear, pressure, or appearances silence her judgment. That, they say, was the beginning of the end of a deception that had hidden in plain sight for too long. If you enjoy stories like this, please like and subscribe for more folk tales.